give my consent.
Thumbs up.
Yeah.
And we also have a message from our events team regarding the logistics of this.
We finish by 1 o'clock or 1:15?
Yes, officially, our event is until 1 o'clock, but if we have more questions, we can proceed upon 1:15. So we have the extra 15 minutes if we have an abundance of questions. So it gives us the flexibility.
Okay.
I can see participants are bundling up
Mm-hmm.
in rapid succession. I have to give a special kudos to those who were so eager for this presentation that they joined half an hour earlier, just to be sure
We
that
appreciate that.
Just to get
If you
this.
hear us, we applaud you. Yeah.
We applaud you all the way because they learned from our very first event when we had 200 plus capacity, and our current platform allows 200 people. And some people were unfortunately left out, and we had to send a recording. I think that this was now one point that their eagerness could not stop them, so they were extra time conscious. We may actually give a 5-minute start at 12:05 just to be extra sure that everyone joins.
Oh. In this very moment, I got some EPSO information, which I will share. Very interesting.
So it's exciting when it's 11:59, 20, 30 people are joining. Okay, we're now at 71 and growing.
Oh.
Should we have the slides up, Andras?
Yeah, I'll put them up now. Okay, let's get started.
Okay.
87. Okay, and everybody hears us. That's funny. Hang on a second. Yep. Can you see my Acrobat?
Yes. Yeah. Perfect.
And can you see my video?
Yes, it's going perfect.
And hopefully everybody else. Yeah, I can't see the chat, so anyways, I'll leave that to you for the moderation and the questions and everything else.
Yes, Sol and Lisa, our events managers, are putting the task force onto this. We are always used to a wave of questions, so they will be sending us the questions directly, and always during the presentation, we'll at any point please ask for questions, and we will send free on the pipeline.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So Andre, you wrote that, right? That we were starting at 12:05.
Yes, at 12:05, only to wait for the remaining participants just to double check on that.
Mm-hmm.
We're now 106.
Yeah, I see that. Is everyone in Brussels? Or everybody went home, or how does that work?
So it's really interesting. So as a whole, we were all stationed in Brussels, and then once the pandemic happened, some of us went to the neighboring countries, whether this was now Germany, France, and some stayed there. And we got an email from the traineeship office that we have several options, and in all these options, we had a teleworking capability. So some of us are stationed abroad or at home, or they could return home and they can work from the computer. But I believe a great percentage of all of us is stationed in Brussels.
Right.
From 760 trainees, we're all here, minus those who I think they had the chance to go to their dear ones at home. But we greatly benefit from the fact that the Commission is allowing us to have a second round in October. So 90% of all of us will join in October. Others have cancelled with their contract, or they have left earlier. But I think overall this is really great news because everyone here they'll have the chance to meet you again, possibly in our future events. So this is something that we're truly looking forward to.
Well, happy to say hi in person and get to celebrate that we're out of the confinement one day.
We cannot wait. Yes. Okay. So 2 more minutes to go, and we'll
started.
Yes. Let's start. So I think we're already we're at 124. So this can already start. Okay. So.
Okay.
So welcome everyone to our long-awaited special 4th Careers Subcommittee event as part of our well-known and very well-received Careers and Coffee series. We're very pleased that over 120 participants have joined now our event, and we're still counting at this point with many more to join. As the Careers Coordinator, I would like to welcome our speaker today, Andras Baneth, our ultimate CAST and EPSO expert. He is most famously known as the master behind EU training, with his preparation book series, The Ultimate EU Textbook, being a #1 bestseller all over Europe. We're truly honored by his presence today. It goes without saying that his in-depth insights provide an invaluable help for candidates in their preparation for various tests and competitions to enter EU institutions. This is therefore a unique opportunity for all of you to ask your questions during this event. Without further ado, I'll give the floor now to Andras, who will share experts' insights, tips, and the best practices to prepare for and also pass the test to enter European institutions. Thank you very much, Andras, for joining us today.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure. And just to make sure, I also have the chat box here, but normally the questions should come in through Andre or moderators, so they will pick and choose the ones that they will read out to me. And a warm welcome to everyone, wherever you may be. And just to check that the chat works fine, why don't you type in where you're dialing in from, whether it's Brussels or different places. I guess that should be visible to everyone. I can see already the first time coming in. Many of you are in Brussels, apparently. Others, south of Italy. Okay, I don't know if it's good news or bad news these days, but it's probably good weather down there. Antwerp, Brussels, and all over. Very good. So with that, the chat apparently works and the technology is on our side, which is very good. Whether my kids are going to be on our side, we'll see. So don't be surprised if one of them shows up in the background. But we'll spend the next about 1 hour talking about the selection and recruitment system, a bit of EPSO, a bit of CAST, and obviously answering your questions. And right before this call, I got some information about some upcoming exams, which is pretty good news to most of you, because I guess you will want to participate in those competitions. So what I'll try to do, can you see, Andre, just to tell me whether you can see the frame of Acrobat Reader or just the presentation? Because otherwise I'll put it on full screen so there is no distraction there. Yeah, okay. So let me put that on full screen. And so I just want to say a couple of words on the system, on EPSO, most of which you probably are familiar with, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. Regarding my background, I used to work for the Commission and the Court of Justice for 7 years, and I'm the author of the book, The Ultimate EU Test Book, which has been in publication since 2005. And I'm a co-founder and partner at eutraining.eu, which is a website to prepare you for EPSO competitions. And it has really a wealth of materials with ebooks and online test simulations and webinars. Without any further ado, I like to start with this chart, which provides a pretty basic summary of the kind of recruitment or selection different entities use. And that EPSO is pretty much used for EU institutions, but not for EU agencies. There are some exceptions to that rule. The EU IPO, the Intellectual Property Office in Alicante, for instance, is using EPSO occasionally to select their future temporary agents, but that's really the exception. Most of the agencies do not use this. And the institutions, they do use EPSO's services to select future EU civil servants who will have a permanent contract by and large. But this is not so black or white anymore, because EPSO is used even for temporary agent job selections as well. And I just saw some documents where it seems EPSO will be used for a number of temporary agent selections as well. So broadly, we could say that the institutions, so Commission most notably, but obviously Parliament, Council, Court of Auditors, Court of Justice, the Committee of Regions, Economic Social Committee, they would all use EPSO for their hiring needs. And the small terminology for those of you who are not familiar, EPSO does selection. They do not use, they are not recruiting. Recruitment happens once you are on the reserve list and you are recruitable and you can be placed into a job. And then when it comes to the non-EU part, the consultancies, the think tanks, the corporate lobbyists, the NGOs, all of that obviously have nothing to do with EPSO. They would use their own selection competition, if that's the case, or just simply CV and cover letter. So that's a brief summary of the kind of selection there is. And the EPSO system, essentially a 7-step process with 2 major parts, with 2 exams or series of exams in 2 phases, but there are more procedural steps to it. Always starts with a notice of competition, where they provide all the details. Then comes the check of your eligibility. Eligibility, that's a tongue twister here, where they check whether you have an EU citizenship, whether you meet formal requirements, perhaps a degree, which is usually a bachelor degree that they require from you. It's often that you have completed military service if your country, according to your citizenship, requires that. And there's certain linguistic requirements, but those are not tested in that phase. They are basically checked in different formats later on. And then the third step is application, when you fill in a lot of questions on EPSO's website into an EPSO profile that you would create for yourself, and you do your best to answer all the questions and make sure that you meet all the formal criteria. And once you do, then come the computer-based tests, which are essentially the ones, the well-known and often dreaded verbal, numerical, and abstract reasoning tests, which you need to sit. And the point being that you complete these with the highest possible score. Depending on which competition we're talking about, you may need to be among the best certain number of candidates, or for so-called specialist competitions, this is only required to the extent that you need to pass with 50% scores. So there is a difference how well you perform. Obviously, the better you perform, the higher the chances you will succeed. But there's a difference whether you really need to be among the top 100 or 500 candidates with your scores, or you only need to pass an benchmark. So whether this is considered a true competition against others or just competition against a certain score makes a difference. Because if you are not very good at abstract reasoning, it really impacts your preparation. Do you need to focus on it to such degree, or all you need to do is just pass, so to say? Right. Until now, there was an intermediate test, and that was typically an E-tray exercise, which many candidates really disliked because time tended to be short. There were a lot of documents to analyze, but it's a computer-based test. This is probably not going to be around anymore. So the information we've been hearing is that this is probably going to be dismissed and not used anymore. So there will only be a pre-selection test. Now, let me actually, for 1 second, go back to this point of step 4, the computer-based test, because again, these are rumors, and you may have heard also, and in the coming weeks we'll hear much more, but we're hearing that EPSO wants to actually change the pre-selection part. Perhaps even go back to the old system, and by old system I mean the pre-2010 system, which was used between 2003 and 2010, so the period for which, well, EPSO was created in 2003, as far as I'm aware. And they used a system where they had a lot of EU knowledge questions. So these were the classic questions of how many women commissioners are there in the Barroso Commission, or in the von der Leyen Commission for that matter. And I remember working for a commissioner at the time in the second round of Barroso Commission. And I asked him, well, boss, do you know how many women commissioners are actually there in among your colleagues? So he started counting, and he missed the number by 1. So even a commissioner whose very fellows were asked about in the test didn't know exactly. I mean, it was a pretty nonsensical question of how many women commissioners are there, and how the hell would that have anything to do with you being a good EU civil servant afterwards, whether you've memorized Wikipedia. So I'm wondering whether it makes any sense that they go back to this kind of questions. But I know that recently EPSO has been criticized quite a lot by a lot of officials, saying that the new recruits, they might be great in terms of their competencies because this is what they were tested on, but they know so little about the EU itself for which they work that sometimes they just ask really silly questions as part of their work. So the truth might be somewhere in between, and we need to see how they reform this, if at all. But this is what we're hearing, that there will be more emphasis on the EU knowledge again. Whether that's in the form of a computer-based test, we will see. So we're observing it closely, but for you to know that this might change sometime. How and when, we don't know, because typically it's the Commission's HR department that would come up with some proposal, but EPSO has a governing body, or a board, I think, where each EU institution that uses EPSO services would send a delegate, and they would have their say in the strategy of the selection system. So going back to the steps, the intermediate test that I mentioned will probably be disappearing. And then you have the assessment center. That will most likely stay, again, with those caveats that if there's a change, we never know which direction it's going to go to. But currently, the assessment center takes place in Brussels, exceptionally in Luxembourg, and it's essentially a series of exams in a given day where you need to do an oral presentation. In most competitions, you need to do a group exercise, a competency-based interview, usually similar tests, perhaps even the computer-based tests, depending on which exam we're talking about, and the case study. So the case study usually happens before the day of the assessment center. Formally speaking, it's part of it. And if everything goes good, oh yeah, actually I have here a list with all these. So the group exercise, the CBI, the competency-based interview. For specialists, there's a field-related interview. For some exams, there's an oral presentation and a motivational interview. So you are recruitable. All you need is an empty or a vacant position into which you can be recruited, in principle, by any institution, as long as you are on the reserve list that matches their needs. So this is in a nutshell EPSO. Obviously, we could talk hours and hours about it, and there's tons of materials, tips and tricks, ideas, and methodology and procedural issues on our website, in the book, and elsewhere. Lots of free downloadable materials and webinars, so feel free to check those out. A couple of words about the CAST competitions. I know many of you are very interested in this. So the CAST competitions are contract agents for contract agent selection tool, contract agent for specific tasks. There are quite a few abbreviations flying around, but essentially it's for contract agent jobs. The selection process was changed 2, maybe 3 years ago, where currently it's open-ended. So you need to register in a database. And I encourage you to put a reminder in your calendar or any other system you trust that every 3 months or 6 months, you update that registration and the data you put in there. Because currently you're a commission trainee. Well, as things stand, you might be again a commission trainee in a couple of months, as long as things work out. But then once you get a different position or a different job, you can update your data to be reflected in the database. And once you're in there, so the institutions and the EU bodies and offices, they can get access to those profiles and trigger a selection process for you through EPSO. So if an institution, say commissions, DG Trade, says, hey, I have a need for a contract agent for this specific job, well, they tap into the database, they select a number of candidates or a pool of candidates saying, these candidates seem suitable. And that's when you are requested to sit certain tests. For CAST, there are certain profiles. So it's not just a pool of everyone in a single database, but there are different profiles: secretaries, finance, law, political affairs, all the way to childcare staff and educational psychologists. So there are quite a few variations. It all depends on your background, and it all depends on your qualifications. And the way the system goes, you submit your expression of interest, there's a registration, then there's a shortlist, and that's when the computer-based tests come in, and you need to sit those. Now, you don't need to sit those every single time your name is flagged or picked from the database as a potential contract agent to be hired for a given job. You can do those verbal, numerical, abstract reasoning tests and the competence test, which is related to the profile you have chosen. And then if you succeed, that stays in the system. So it has a validity and you don't need to redo it if you don't end up getting the job, but you actually are looking for another position from the same area, from the same subject matter. And if everything goes well, you get on that reserve list and you get invited to an interview and hopefully get recruited in the end as a contract agent. So it's somewhat similar to the EPSO, but it's more specialized and it's more open-ended and demand-driven. So this is the recap, the comparison between the two systems. So for CAST, you can apply anytime, or at least register into the database anytime. Whereas for EPSO, you can only express your interest when there is a specific competition announced. You need to register for the CAST one, as I mentioned, whereas EPSO, it's more submitting an application. And for the CAST, it's really demand driven. So HR and the hiring department would invite you from the database and tell you you need to sit computer-based test now. But it's on a rolling basis. It's on an ongoing basis. Currently suspended because of the virus, but hopefully that will resume in a couple of weeks. And then for EPSO, everyone basically is entitled to sit the computer-based tests as long as you meet the formal requirements, you're eligible. And for the CAST, the pass mark is enough. So there's no competition in the sense that you're not competing against the other candidates on the scores of your abstract verbal numerical tests. Whereas for EPSO, in most cases, you need to get the highest score to pass compared to the other candidates. And as we said before, for CAST, as you pass the test, you can be invited to job interviews. Whereas for EPSO, you need to be in the reserve list, and then still you need to be picked for a specific job and invited to an interview. So there are lots of Facebook groups that sometimes we nurture or we create, or others do that, and we promote those. If you're interested, if you're on Facebook, join those, and you can follow all the news and rumors and ideas with everyone. And actually, I'll stop right here. I just wanted to give you this very brief overview and to set the scene, and I'm really happy to answer questions based on careers or specific EPSO stuff or any other. And while you are thinking about your questions, and I'll probably pull up here the chat box, or perhaps have Andre moderate those questions and read those out. Just one word. So I mentioned EPSO's planned reform. We don't yet know how ambitious this is going to be and which direction it's going to take. So we're all keeping our eyes and ears open to see that. And then number two, there are quite a few competitions coming up. So everything has been put on hold, including ongoing competitions and assessment. Assessment Center should resume from September, but what you're probably more interested in is the new exams. And there will be, it's been confirmed, there will be exams on European law, so European lawyers. It will be most likely an 85, perhaps 86, but I think 85 competition, open competition. So as long as you have a degree in law or related areas, you will qualify as an applicant. Will probably be competition for secretaries and clerks. There will be lots of competitions coming up in IT security, data, privacy, and related fields. This one on the IT and digital and privacy areas is probably going to be temporary agent jobs, but still temporary agents jobs are very attractive still. And I've even seen things like sustainable agriculture expert and similar fields. So these are quite specialist areas. But again, if you have that background or you meet the formal qualifications, then this could be an interesting path for you. So with that, over to you, and let's see the questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Andras, for this really great insights. We've been receiving a wave of questions, and we selected 3 really great questions that are relevant to this section of the presentation, and we'll bundle more as time goes by during this wonderful event. One point which you've mentioned is that assessment centers will be reopened in September. One question from our fellow trainees is, do you know if the EPSO tests, e.g. CBT, will also be done online, or must we wait until end of the lockdown to be able to sit these tests?
Yeah, so I've heard, again, this is rumor, so very hard to tell whether this is a true policy coming or just ideas flying around, is to have the CBT, actually, everyone, you can do it from your home or wherever you are, but everybody at the same time. So I think this is how they try to prevent any fraud or any cheating or any undue advantage, is that they might say, okay, on this and this specific date at this hour, you can do the tests with your computer, That's the only time pretty much, but you don't need to go to a test center or elsewhere. Now, very practically speaking, I think it's not a bad idea, and it merits consideration. I'm just wondering whether they can roll it out now in the middle of this chaos that we're all experiencing. So having such a novel way of running the tests, and I don't think they are so desperate or so eager to just get it started no matter what. So perhaps they will just wait a couple of weeks or mid-June or early July and say we resume the tests in our usual test centers, and then we will experiment with that sort of new method. So again, I'm not going to tell you anything more meaningful than that. I'm just telling you how I see the pros and cons of that system.
This is really insightful to clarify this. Many are still a bit scared about what are the effects of the lockdown, but I think this is very good information for all of us to know. On our next question is, and this is applicable within our demographic, how relevant is our professional experience in particular number of years when it comes to our chances of being eventually recruited after passing EPSO or CAST?
Yeah, in formal terms, it's not important. So I mean, in procedural formal terms, as long as you qualify to sit those tests and exams, then you can be on the reserve list, and in principle, you are recruitable. But in practice, certainly having some relevant experience, having some work experience, especially in the field that you really want to get a position in, it's helpful. You know, I'm not going to say that this is irrelevant and you're out of university with zero work experience and zero internship and zero summer jobs or any extracurricular activities, and you're going to be hired immediately. It's more difficult. So perhaps use this time to get either some experience through remote work, or now as part of your internship, try to do even more, help those who are perhaps constrained by their health conditions or their family situation or any other. And then you can demonstrate that in your CV, in your cover letter, when it gets to the recruitment part, so the very end of the process. Or perhaps you want to do a couple of online courses and get a certificate. And there are a number of websites from edX to Coursera to Udemy to all those where you can even get a formal certificate that you've done a course on data privacy or a course on project management, whatever it may be. So try to have those additional things in your professional background, because that will help your recruitment, even if in formal terms you are not required to have those things.
Mm-hmm. This is really insightful. Many of us, they're of knowing exactly how much experience is necessary, but this really clarifies for everyone that they have the potential to enter institutions with the experiences that they have to this degree. A further question is, when talking about the tests, is it possible to fail one assessment and excel in the others and still make it if the average is among the top 100? Or is one fail, one out? So in the sense of if someone fails, is this the end? Or is there an average that they should make?
Yeah, I see the point. If we talk about very specifically assessment center itself, so that's the second round of exams in the course of the EPSO process. The assessment center, as I said, has multiple exams in it, and failing, well, it depends on to what degree you fail. So for instance, if you do a group exercise where you are requested, usually the 6 of you with 6 other participants, you sit around the table, you need to analyze a background file and have a meaningful discussion around it. You can't really fail that exercise, because what the assessors do is that they observe you and they will give you scores on different competencies that they are measuring. And there are 2 or 3 competencies that they're observing in the context of that specific exam. So they might say, okay, this person doesn't really have very high working with others, team working skills, and they give you a relatively low score. But even that they do not give on the basis of that single exercise. They also look at how you perform in the competency-based interview, and jointly they come up with a score for the working with others competency. So what I'm saying is, you cannot truly fail an exam as part of the assessment center. You can get a relatively low score, which is usually graded on a scale of 0 to 10. And if you don't get at least 3 points, you do fail in a given competency: communication, leadership, working with others, resilience, and others. But as long as you have more than 3, you pretty much pass, but it may not be sufficient for you to be among the top X number of candidates. So if the question very specifically related to the assessment, let's say 90% or 95% of candidates are not truly going to fail a given competency. They just don't perform well enough to qualify for the reserve list.
This definitely gives everyone a peace of mind, especially given the very strict thresholds in EPSO, not as much as in CAST, but as a whole, that it's not the end of the world. They just have to be really focused and to focus on exactly how to complete the test. So it's not the end of the world per se. We're now in the second round of questions. So the first question is now, do you know if the rule of languages will remain the same? Do you recommend taking the first exam in our native language and the second part in English, for example?
Yeah, that's a question that often comes up, and there's I think the term is arbitrage, but correct me if I'm wrong, where you can pretty much play around with different combinations and make the most of it. So when it comes to languages, language 1 and language 2. So language 1 is typically the language that is your mother tongue, as long as it's an EU official language. And language 2 is your first foreign language. So for instance, I'm Hungarian, and that's probably my language 1, and then English would be language 2, which is a pretty clear combination because Hungarian is not among the top languages in the system. But if you happen to speak English, French, or English or French or Italian or Spanish or German, so these are the top 5 languages, then you have a bit of luxury to play around. So let's say if your mother tongue is German and then you speak fluent English, you can think about which one would be language 1 and language 2. Perhaps language 1, I often recommend, should be a language in which you can process passively information fast, because the tests in language 1 are usually where you need to read and analyze information in the computer-based system. Whereas language 2 tends to be the language of the assessment center. So where your expression, your active oral written expression is the best. So it's up to you whether, for instance, my written French is not that good because I think writing in French is pretty difficult, but writing well in French. So often when I write in French, it's pretty much a translation of my English speaking. But because of that reason, I probably wouldn't choose French if I had to do a case study, because my English is much more sophisticated when it comes to writing. But when it comes to understanding, French would be fine because I process the information pretty fast. So there's a bit of thinking there. It really depends on how well you master a given language. I actually caught a question here, if I may jump in and answer that, because it's an interesting one, whether you can work as a freelancer for the EU. I think it was something like that. And yeah, there's a bit of terminology there, I think, to unpack. Freelancer as an external professional providing services to the EU, perhaps. And EU, what does that mean? It's usually for one of the institutions, namely mostly perhaps Parliament or Commission. And there are a lot of companies, a lot of organizations that provide services to the institutions. Usually they are subjected to a tender. So there is a large tendering procedure. But I know a lot of people who work as subcontractors to these organizations. So if there's a communications agency that won a huge contract with the Commission to popularize, I don't know, the Green New Deal or something of some maybe soon economic recovery and all the actions the Commission and the EU institutions will be doing, they often find subcontractors to help with that work if it's an increased workload. So whether it's analytical or more communication or perhaps training, all of these are possibilities. But to tell the Commission and say, hey, I'm a freelancer, I'm a social media consultant, and I want to help you, well, unless you know the president personally and you are from her former media advisors, that can work. But with that snark aside, there is certainly some services that are available that you can provide, but usually it's more senior professionals and high-level advisors. Back to you with other questions.
Thank you very much for the clarification on freelancer. The terminology is indeed broad, but it does help unpack exactly that all types of professional experience have a strong potential. On the following question is that concerning future changes by EPSO or the CBT verbal, numerical, abstract tests, are they expected to be out of the selection phase in the future?
What was the last part? Are
they expected to be out of the selection phase in the future?
We don't know. Basically, since 2003, the abstract verbal numerical reasoning has been used as a test. So for almost 17 years, they've been the norm, even when there were strong criticisms against them. And a lot of people were just very unhappy with this type of tests, and still they persisted. And part of the reason, at least from a professional or occupational psychology perspective or HR and recruitment perspective, is that there needs to be some system through which they can filter candidates. Imagine the number of candidates there are for the EPSO competitions, typically 10,000, 20,000, even more, depending on how many exams are running in a given year. And you need to find a way where you narrow the number of candidates to a manageable level. And you need to find a way which is as objective as humanly possible. You cannot just do a random selection and the CVs, or you cannot say those with blonde hair are in and those with blonde hair are out. You know, it's very easy to discriminate candidates even involuntarily. So not these sarcastic examples of hair color, but even things like how would you find a way where those who qualify for a given job or position can be truly selected in a semi-automatic way. And this is what the abstract verbal numerical tests actually do, is they narrow the number of candidates who will be then tested in the assessment center. So I'm really wondering on what basis will this selecting out happen? Because then the second phase is the selecting based on your merits and your competencies. It could be your EU knowledge, but will EU knowledge be a good predictor of how good of an EU civil servant you would be? Well, that used to be the thinking, but it's not really the case. So if you happen to have self-discipline or very lexical mind that you can just memorize all those things, it wouldn't mean that you're a good worker or you're able to manage a project or come up with some innovative idea. So yeah, it's a difficult one, and that's why the current system is a relatively good system, perhaps even I would say a good system, with the caveat that I agree that the EU knowledge is a missing link, that I understand the need that once you hire someone, they should be operational from day one. That also means they need to know more about the institution for which they work.
100%. This brings a lot of clarification on the aspects of the CBT and on the selection phase in this sense. I think something which is incredibly topical, and this is a question which has been raised by our trainees, is regarding British trainees. For British trainees, the question is, with no other European nationality, especially linguists, are there any paths we can take to still work for the Commission or any of the other agencies?
Yeah, British trainees, you're not in an easy position. right now, because the institution, so even in any new exam that they will publish, Brits will not qualify because they are not EU citizens anymore. So that is a very complicated story, where they can certainly qualify for other jobs. They qualify for, say, non-EU institution jobs, but otherwise the citizenship is part of the requirements to hold a temporary agent or a job. So what opportunities does that leave? Well, outside the official institutional arena. So obviously, if you want to work for an NGO or a think tank or a lobby firm or consultancy or any other, sure, they don't have such restrictions, not formally at least. Practically speaking, how open or willing or interested they are to hire Brits, that's another matter. Brits certainly have the huge advantage over all of us that they are native speakers, so they can proofread all the typos and grammatical errors that I do, and they can communicate typically, again, I'm generalizing, but being a native speaker, that gives those advantages. But other than that, these are the constraints that need to be highlighted.
Definitely. I believe that as a long-term fan of your books and the materials and taking part in the EU training where we actually met, I personally have a question regarding what specific abilities and skills are tested in each exam. I believe that all of us, we come from various environments, but how specific can we actually be within our background? Personally, my background is in peace and security. Is there something for everyone, or do we try to fit the mold given by the specific EPSO requirements?
And with the disclaimer that I might slightly repeat myself, but EPSO is the selection system, or the office that does the selection, and they try, well, if we're talking about a generalist competition, they really do a very broad selection, where if you meet certain basic criteria and you're among the top scoring candidates, you get into the pool, the reserve list. But increasingly, they are doing more and more specialist competitions. So they might look for perhaps peace experts, or those who are experts in human rights or international development. And that's a more narrow filter. Yet they're only doing the selection. They are not the HR office. They're not the hiring service. So it's a little bit like a concentric circle, whereas here's this circle that EPSO would look for. For specialist exams, it's a bit more narrow circle, but the actual hiring is a little circle where you really need to fit the job that they want to fill. So depending on your profile, it's always an interesting question whenever I get asked about it, is, well, here's my background, here's what I studied, here's my work experience, if I have any, where do I fit? And certainly, where do you fit and what do you want to do? So you might be a peace expert, but you're really interested in sustainable agriculture, for that matter, okay? And that's a difficult one because your background doesn't really orientate you into that field. So that's a problem. But if your background and your interests kind of overlap, then you can go for a specialist competition, and that would fit you nicely. Another example, if you happen to have background in, say, natural sciences, you're a chemical engineer, you are you have a qualification in whatever, biology. Often EU agencies are really good at hiring you. Or let me rephrase it, EU agencies are very relevant for your profile because they tend to hire those with more specialized or specialist backgrounds. So it's really finding that match between your profile and the kind of competition we talk about. And the more specialist you are, the more, well, specialist competition would be a fit, or the agencies. Somebody, I think, here asked, I just caught that question, can you apply for two different places or profile? yes, the basic, the ground rule is you can apply for as many things as you like, unless it's specifically excluded. So even if there are 5, 6 competitions running in parallel, which hopefully will be the case in a few months, and as long as you qualify for them, you can apply for all of them. So it's a bit of it's a strategy as well, that you can try multiple paths and multiple channels, again, as long as you formally meet the formal criteria for those.
That's really interesting. And maybe branching out within this question, is it as a strategy, the more specialized you are, the more likely are you able to get in? Within your book, you presented a really interesting statistic that if you're an Irish translator, which not many of us are, you get inside much easier. I mean, how can we try to like find the specialty exactly? Should we try to become extra different to have higher chances?
Oh, this is such yeah, it's a complex question. There are so many variations, permutations to it. Well, if you are ambitious to the degree that you want to get into the institutions and you're pretty patient, you can go far. What I mean by that is, you mentioned your background is in peace building and probably international relations. So if you say, well, this is my dream job to be, but I really want to get there, not immediately, or I'm okay not getting there immediately. And perhaps you take a job as a German, Romanian, Italian, whatever, translator. That's your foot in the door, as they call that in sales. And you're okay with that. It's a bit of a compromise, or not necessarily that's your ultimate destination, but you're willing to do that for 2 years. And you say, okay, in 2 years, I'm going to do this job. I'm fine with that. And I will be looking for opportunities as a result during that time. So then you can get there. But if you say desperately, I really want to get into the external action service and work on Kosovo, I want to work on in the Middle East, I want to work in Central Asia, and that's my thing, well, it's much harder to wait for that opportunity, wait for the right time and the right kind of job. So that's why it's a difficult one to say where my profile fits, or how far are you willing to go, or how fast do you want to get there to your
100%, and I think it's really good to keep that strategy in mind while taking the steps of applying. We're entering now the fourth round of questions. We've had so many questions, but we selected the ones that would create the debate. Very relevant, as we mentioned before the presentation, our traineeship has been extended. And as a whole, would you recommend that we would apply straight away after Blue Book, or can it enhance our chances if we gain some work experiences first? Or will a fresh Blue Book experience be an advantage? So mostly would we be at an advantage if we apply in October, in the October session, or
apply for the exams, or apply for
for EPSO cast?
Right. Look, I don't think it hurts to apply. So if you have the time, the energy, the dedication to apply for these competitions, and you can sit the exams, sure, go ahead and do it. Generally, the more reserve lists you are on, the better your chances. And in the meantime, you can still gain work experience. And in worst case, you redo the exam, or you do another exam and you are on another reserve list. So I wouldn't wait for the perfect moment, and rather try when it's good enough that you can do it. And as I said, in the meantime, you gain work experience, you get that extra, say, that addition to your profile, and that will make you a more attractive staff to be hired later on. And I think there was another aspect of the question I may have missed, but and in the meantime, while you're looking at it, I saw that somebody's asking on a very specific EPSO question whether situational judgment test will be part of the exams, and most probably it won't be. So most probably they will stop that, similarly to the E-tray. Again, these are rumors we're hearing. I believe they didn't have SJT, the situational judgment test, last time for the generalist competitions. It was pretty heavily criticized as a test, saying that it's not entirely, say, water, or what is it, bulletproof or watertight. So there are some subjective elements to it, and perhaps that's the reason why they decided to scrap it. But it seems that it will not be part of the, not be among the tests in the future.
Definitely, and I think that if we could enter more into speculations, there's one question heard from gossip, I guess, that I've heard that for the cast we need to be invited by the head of unit. Is this information correct?
Well, typically, yes, because typically it's head of units who are responsible for their teams and those working in their particular unit. And they are the ones who say, okay, I have a vacancy for this particular position. So they are the ones who trigger the process or indicate the hiring need to the relevant services and say, okay, I need to fill this position because this person went on maternity leave, or they are on a sick leave, or they've just traveled to Indonesia for hiking. So it's really, there's the specific need comes from them because they are responsible for the HR of their unit. Well, HR not, but rather the actually responsible for those jobs within their units.
This is really interesting, and it's really good that we will clarify this question, as many of us were really debating the correctness of this. There's a question of strategy, and this is something that personally I've also been thinking is that the trainees are wondering if by passing cast and when we achieve a temporary contract and when the temporary contract will be over, do we need to make EPSO later? So do we have to compete for EPSO later, or will the cast provide future vacancies and will put us on the same level with other candidates that pass an 85?
Right. Yeah, that's a very relevant question and very practical issue to address. Short answer, yes. Long answer is, once your internship is over, well, that's a fixed 5-month period. As you know it well now with the virus, it's a very special situation, but it's a fixed term period. Stay on in any shape or form, you need to pass some sort of an exam. Now, having said that, with temporary agent is typically more beneficial and it's a more attractive proposition than the contract agent. So temporary agent contracts are, I believe, either 3-year or 5-year, and it can go up to 7 years. So there is an extension possible for that. Usually the salary itself is also higher. So for many reasons, it's a more attractive proposition. And in some agencies or in some situations, there's even a thing, and I think it only exists in the EU, an unlimited temporary contract, which is a beautiful linguistic innovation where you say it's an open-ended temporary thing. And the reason why it's temporary because it's easier to terminate if there is a specific, I use the term business need, but if there's a specific use case, they just no longer need a certain service or there are budget cuts or other. But temporary agent is a more attractive job proposition. But to turn that into a fonctionnaire, so turn it into civil servant permanent contract, well, it's the same thing as for the contract agents. Again, you need to pass a competition and you need to pass an EPSO competition for a permanent job. And this is the way. Now, there's another interesting thing, and I believe there is actually going to be an internal competition coming. So internal competition is usually it's limited to those who already have a permanent contract. Let's say you're an assistant, an AST3 permanent contract, or you are a temporary agent. Perhaps they open it to contract agents as well. And they say you can become a permanent AD5 official, but only as long as you are already in the institutions with a special kind of contract. So these internal competitions, which are still competitions, but they are somewhat different from the open competitions that any European citizen can apply for. But yes, as long as a contract has an expiration date, some EPSO competition to make it open-ended and a permanent job. Yeah, I think somebody has their microphone on. I hear some background noise. So whoever hears this, make sure that you are muted, because that gets broadcast to everyone else.
The events team will investigate this for sure. Thank you very much for
send in the soldiers. Yeah,
send in the soldiers to solve. But as a whole, thank you very much for answering this question, which provided so much insights on the application. We have 5 more minutes remaining from the event. The event officially would end until 1:15 if we have more questions. But if it's time sensitive, do you want to end the presentation by 1, or would you like to continue with the next round of questions?
I'd say 1:05 would be great, because then I need to have my other obligations. But I caught 1 or 2 questions here about, say, the EEAS, so the European External Action Service, where somebody was asking whether you can apply there directly or does it go through EPSO. And the EEAS is a very special kind of institution. Well, it's not even an institution, it's a service, and that's a distinction mostly for lawyers, but it's not among the EU institutions in a classic legal sense. It's a service which is sort of a hybrid, where it has its own staff, but it has a lot of secondment as part of its staff. So from the Commission, from the Council, and by that nature from member states. So EEAS is a bit of a hybrid, where very often it's member states who would place some of their diplomats or experts into the EEAS. And EEAS also employs quite a few local staff. So wherever there's an EEAS delegation around the world, they would also hire a couple of local staff. Now, depending on where you might be coming from, it could be an interesting thing. So if you're perhaps not an EU citizen, those listening right now, that might be an interesting path to work at an EEAS delegation as a local staff. How to get hired with the EEAS is a little unclear even to me. So it's not entirely clear that sometimes the path is through the Commission. So you might work at maybe DG Agri or DG Trade or others that have an external aspect to their work, and then you get sent to an EEAS delegation somewhere in the world. You can obviously apply, but it's an internal application, and they would evaluate your candidacy and then place you in a given country. So I've had a few friends who are at really faraway places, and that's closest in its nature to a diplomatic service, where perhaps your entire family might go with you, depending on your family situation. You might even get some security allowance if it's a dangerous country, based on various indicators and numbers. So that's a slightly different thing. But even so, you could be an EU official, or you could be a temporary agent at that work for the EEAS under those contracts.
That's excellent. We are now having three more questions as part of the last round of the questions. I think all of them, they're interrelated to a degree. The first one is a purely technical one on where do you register to create the CAST profile. The second one is related to the limitations on how much we can apply. We previously discussed about if we fail one time, how we can get up to the end of the world. But are there any limitations for EPSO and CAST? Are there any differences between the two exams in terms of failing? And the last one would be the quotas for nationalities. Is it easier, more difficult to pass based on nationality?
Okay, let me start with the first. So in terms of where you register on EPSO's website for the EPSO one. For CAST, it might go also through the EPSO. I actually haven't checked the registration page for some time, or there might be a dedicated page, but you just put EU CAST registration or CAST database, and you should be able to find that. But it might be through your EPSO profile directly, or inside the EPSO page directly. How many times you can take the test? There are no limitations for the EPSO exams. So you can take as many times as you like. If you fail, you just retake it. And as I said, you can go in parallel and sign up to as many exams as you like, as long as there is no formal criterion or formal notice that you cannot apply for this particular exam if you applied for that particular exam. Rarely, but they do have such exceptions when they say either or, you need to choose. Or perhaps if an exam runs on 2 levels, occasionally it might run on AD5 and AD7 level in parallel, depending on your background or work experience, then you need to choose one or the other. But in terms of failing, you can retry. You don't have any, say, history with them, and they wouldn't say, okay, you failed too many times, or you have a certain, it's not blacklist, but any sort of negative history that might impact your scores in one way or another. Number 2, for CAST is slightly different. So again, you could do that without limitation, but there are certain restrictions there. So if you failed the CBT, so the computer-based tests, I need to double check, but I think you might need to wait 6 months before you can do it again. So there is some limitation there of how quickly you can do that. But once you pass, I believe that score will be valid for quite many years. So that gets added to your profile and you don't need to redo it. So once you've passed it, they say, okay, check mark, this person has done the minimum, so to say. Even if you don't get a given job, they wait to invite you again. The score stays in your profile and you don't need to sit that again. And yes, thanks to whoever commented here, much appreciated. Yes, you have to take 6 months to retake the test. So that's the idea. And indeed, after you stay on, and it's for 5 years validity. So for CAS, there is some limitation there. But again, it's not really, it's more of waiting for a certain time, but it's not going to disadvantage you and get your score deducted from the next effort or the next round. And I think the third question, what was the third question of the quota nationalities?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a very tricky one. So in the staff regulations, they say that the institutions are aiming for a broad geographic balance among their staff. Now, that's a really tough nut to crack, because if you are, let's say, if you're Romanian, Romania joined in 2007. There was a huge wave of competition where tons of people came in, again, to bring some sort of a balance into the mix. But if there are, let's say, 5,000 Romanians on 85 level or 86 level, whereas you might have 3 Brits as directors general, how do you compare that? It's not just the sheer number of staff, but on which level are they are in the career, in the system. So that makes it more complex. And then AD level officials, AST level officials. And then the size of the country, obviously, in proportion to the others. So Malta, Cyprus, Ireland, Latvia, and then compare it to Spain and Poland and Italy. So they're trying to find, again, this relative balance. It's very hard to make it truly meaningful. Having said that, a lot of Belgians, interesting, a lot of Belgians, often on admin, so secretarial assistant level. So if you happen to have Belgian nationality, might be difficult for those type of positions. For others, yeah, I'm trying to say something meaningful, but it's really hard. Well, Scandinavians are often underrepresented. So there are actually fewer Scandinavians than the institutions would like to have. So if you happen to be coming from those countries, that's probably a plus. And then I think there are quite a few Italians, Greeks, perhaps Romanians, Bulgarians, Spanish. I think these countries, their citizens are quite eager to work for the institutions for many reasons, economic and other. It's and because of that, it might be more difficult to get hired because of that. But again, if you're going for a specialist profile and you have that qualification, you pass the competition, you have the profile, it should be a lesser problem, a lesser consideration, because your other qualifications would make you more eligible. Yeah. So I'm trying to just point out the different considerations they would look at when hiring. Sometimes nationality becomes a really important thing, indeed. When they are saying, okay, if we have 3 equally suitable candidates, and one is coming from a country from which we have already had many EU permanent officials, that might play to your disadvantage. Not trying to sell any illusion here. But again, the more unique you are, so to say, in your profile, the competency, the competition, and the job, the less nationality would come into play as a negative factor.
Excellent. This was a very interesting insight that we may need the deterministic nationality, and that if we are special and we can focus on differentiating ourselves and becoming specialized, we can pass through. As a Romanian, I believe that I'll be happy to know that there are many Romanians as our fellow Eastern neighbors, Hungarians. And also, I may consider to actually get a Belgian nationality. Who knows? Maybe this will be an added advantage. But as a whole, thank you, Andras, for your fantastic presentation. Our trainees who have signed up for this very special event have greatly benefited from your insights, which has truly enabled them for the future career paths in EU institutions. At the peak of the event, we are 150 trainees and counting. And all of these insights, please do consider to have even more insights in the Ultimate EU Textbook, Administration 2020. This is my so-called Bible, and reading it
This is very nice that you're pitching it and not me, and I didn't even put it in the bookshelf behind me.
It's mutual promotion and solidarity to help each other. But as a whole,
much appreciated.
Our pleasure. This book will give you greatly benefit you with strategies, skills, and advice for EPSO and AD level exams, and we'll have a direct link for the purchasing of this book in our newsletter. As house rules, the following event has been recorded according to the Careers Committee GDPR policy of making everyone aware for attending the event. The recording will be stored on our private YouTube channel until the end of M2020 session of until the end of 31st of July. And we'll be sharing this recording and the remaining questions which Andras has offered to answer, and we'll be posting these questions in our Monday's newsletter. To wrap up, I'd like to thank again our amazing speaker, Andras, for this wonderful and very insightful presentation. And I'd like to give my team, Lisa, Sol, and everyone part of the events team, a special shout out for organizing such a successful event. And thank you all for participating. We are truly looking forward for your attendance next week. All the best, everyone, and thank you very much for participating. Thank you, Andras, for this event. This is
thanks for being here. Thanks for the invitation, and hope to follow up in person soon.
Definitely, 100%. We'll talk. All the best. Have a good day.
Mulțumesc. Bye.
Cu plăcere.